Hi guys, welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be doing, you guessed it, another book review, even though I've been doing a series of film reviews, and I might get back into that, or I might not, I don't know. So anyways, this book, I'm getting pretty close to finishing it. I'm just a few pages away from finishing it, and unfortunately, even though I like the author, like Ottessa Moshfegh, I've read two other books by her, and this one, to be honest, it just isn't hitting the same way as her other books. And I think the reason why is that I kind of can predict, I can predict a lot of what's going to happen. And for some reason, it's just the writing style isn't as good as I thought it would be. Like, for instance, My Year of Rest and Relaxation I really liked, and Eileen I really liked. And for some reason, this book by Ottessa Moshfegh just isn't hitting the same way. But it still is about Ottessa Moshfegh. A lot of her books center around the main character being a really unlikable, unreliable narrator who's a woman, who's isolated, maybe a little mentally ill, or their perception of the world is very distorted and inaccurate. So Death in Her Hands is about this elderly woman named Vesta. She's a widow. Her husband died recently, and she lives by herself with her dog in the middle of the woods. And while she's walking her dog, one day she finds a note lying on the ground, and it says this: "Her name was Magda. Nobody will ever know who killed her. It wasn't me. Here is her dead body." Of course, the note, there was no visible dead body in sight, and so it's very mysterious. The main character, Vesta, picks up this note and just for the rest of the novel is obsessed with it, and it just follows Vesta's kind of psychological hyperfixation on this note. And so because she's so isolated, she really projects herself onto Magda, and she imagines how old Magda is, what Magda looks like, who her parents are like, where Magda is from, and everything that could have possibly led to her murder. And so I have an outline for this video that I'm going to try to stick to. And so Vesta she visits her local library, and since she's elderly, she doesn't know she doesn't have a lot of internet literacy, but she is able to kind of do a quick Google search on how to conduct a murder investigation because she wants to take this matter into her own hands. But she approaches it in a very logically flawed way. She uses prompts for fleshing out character profiles for writing murder mysteries as this is her starting point. So for her investigation, and she just lets her imagination just run wild, and she loses all objectivity. And it really juxtaposes with her former husband. His name is Walter, and he was a scientist. He was very egotistical, very full of himself, very callous, very condescending, and their marriage, unfortunately, was very flawed, and she felt very alone when she was with Walter. And she loses all objectivity during this murder investigation because she approaches it as if she just really lets her imagination run wild with who the suspects could be, who Magda is, what type of person Magda is, even though she really knows nothing about Magda. And it juxtaposes who she was formerly married to, because Walter was scientific and logical to a fault. He was not a friendly dude. He was very unlikable. He was very pompous and full of himself. And she was honestly very catering to him, to his emotional needs, and really neglected herself in order to preserve the relationship. And as I said before, she projects her own characteristics onto Magda. Magda, for example, she believes is the daughter of Eastern European immigrants, and Vesta also happens to be the daughter of Eastern European immigrants. And she believes Magda is very exotic looking, she stands out, she's rough around the edges, she's attractive, but not too beautiful, like Vesta, because unfortunately she was married to someone who was very condescending And Walter would tell Vesta things such as, oh, from your eyes, like from the nose up, you look beautiful, but from the nose down, you look like a witch or whatever. So very callous, very cruel. He never really, like in the beginning of their marriage, he was probably very loving, but as the years went by, he just became more and more distant. And she believes that he probably had a lot of affairs with his research assistants, who all happened to be young, beautiful women. So Vesta is very insecure, but also sees herself in this made-up character, Magda. And also she gives a name to the person who she believes wrote the note, Blake. And she chose the name Blake because it sounds like an obnoxious, naive teenage boy's name who would probably fawn over Magda and give her a place to stay, because she imagines, oh, Magda probably like ran away from the Eastern European country that she came from and has no place to stay, and so she probably, some young teenage boy was probably fascinated by her and would allow her to basically crash at his place. And I think this is very interesting because it's sad, because whenever you give a name to something, like let's say you're like studying biology or conducting like an experiment, you never want to like give a name to like the specimen that you're like researching, because you're going to become emotionally attached to it, whether you know it or not, like subconsciously. And so I believe as this story goes on, as she investigates this so-called murder and like who could have possibly wrote this note, it gives Vesta a purpose, and it allows her to combat her loneliness and isolation as an elderly person living alone in the woods. So I think there's a lot of different levels of irony in this novel. I think it's very much like a dark comedy. Also, it's very like meta, because it's like murder mystery novels in general are very like formulaic, and they don't really have a deeper meaning other than serving as a puzzle for you to solve. Like it's a whodunit mystery. It's not supposed to leave you feeling like very disturbed or contemplative. It's just a way for you to like exercise the logical, rational part of your mind. And the main character, Vesta, when she like critiques or makes fun of murder mystery novels or films and describes them as like an artless genre, which is kind of like funny because technically this book could be described as like a murder mystery. It's technically a murder mystery, you could say, but it's without a murder taking place. What it really is it's kind of like a psychological thriller or like a character study, because it tracks the psychological unraveling of an elderly woman in isolation. And one of the questions that I thought to myself while I was reading this book was, would you rather have your wits about you and be unhappy, or lose your wits or your sanity and have a sense of purpose and accomplishment? Because there was a clear shift in this book from when she had a solid routine going, she was taking care of her dog properly, she was still very isolated, but then there was a tipping point when she became obsessed with the note, but then all of a sudden she had purpose. And she would enter this flow state with just like scribbling down all of her thoughts regarding who Magda is and who her killer could be. And it just all of a sudden preoccupied her mind and gave her a purpose. And so it kind of allows her to be creative, but of course, it's a slippery slope, right? Your decision-making process is based off of how you perceive reality, and if you have a very flawed and accurate perception of reality, then of course a lot of mistakes are going to be made and a lot of damage is going to be done, whether to yourself or other people. And so this leads me to the broader theme of the book, which is, I guess, our Western understanding of mental illness is more often than not the result of societal ills, because unfortunately there's a lot of studies that show that elderly people tend to be very depressed because they've lost like their like mobility, or they're no longer able to participate in society in the way that they used to. They're no longer able to do all of their like hobbies, and like the loss of like physical strength over time, especially if you have dementia or just like cognitive decline in general. And it's just really sad. And also, Vesta in particular, she lives out in the middle of the woods. Her neighbors, when the few times that she's run into them, are very unfriendly and don't really show any interest in getting to know her. But thankfully, she does meet some other characters in this book who do seem friendly, who do seem to care about her general well-being. So it's kind of, there's like a give and take there. But one of the questions you have to ask yourself is like, why do elderly people in general not have enough support? And how come depression and loneliness is a major issue among like elderly people? And I mean, of course, I've ranted about this before on my channel, but it's basically, we live in such like a individualistic society. Everybody's so caught up with what they need to do in order to survive. I just feel like older people, we don't really have such a robust sense of community anymore. And so, yeah, it's just, there's a lot of irony in this book. Another example of irony is that she reads a poem by William Blake that she finds in the library, and she thinks Blake, whoever wrote the note and left it for her, like she thinks that when she reads this poem by William Blake, that Blake chose that poem specifically for her to read, and that within that poem there's a secret message or a hidden clue that's going to lead her closer to the truth of Magda's murder. And the poem itself is about ignorance. It's about the blind leading the blind when they themselves should be led. And instead of recognizing that as a moment for, self-reflection and, realization, like, oh, maybe it's not healthy for me to spend all of my time hyper-fixating on these characters that I've made up in my head and this note that I found, like, maybe I should try to, like, reach out to resources in my community and try to, just be surrounded by other people. Even if I don't get along with those people, even if I don't really click with them, maybe that, at least being exposed to like other people would be healthier than me just living in my mind space. And that's what she refers it to as, like, her mind or her thoughts. Like she feels like her mind isn't solely confined to like her head. Like she believes it's kind of like this cloud that like extends out into the environment, and that you can like share a mind space and you can share thoughts with other, human beings, as well as like pets and like loved ones. And I kind of agree with that premise, that our mind space, it's not just something that's like strictly confined to our head. It's something that can be shared with other people. I'm not saying that you can be like telepathic with a loved one, but oftentimes when you share a routine with somebody, like a husband or like a family member, you'll kind of have like this very connected sense of like intuition, like without even knowing, you can like kind of anticipate their needs or what they're thinking depending on how well you know them. But basically, this was a very, I guess it is a good book. I think I would recommend it, but if you're going to read something by Ottessa Moshfegh, I think you should start off with My Year of Rest and Relaxation, because that also tackles like privilege, which I think is really interesting to unpack. But unfortunately, I don't know why I didn't connect with this book as much as her other works. I don't know, but I do agree, like, even with myself, I notice if I spend too much time by myself in isolation, my thoughts, especially, they're just, like, this kind of reminds me of, like, Buddhism, where it's like, you shouldn't place too much weight in your thoughts. Like, your thoughts are just thoughts. They don't really mean anything. You should just be, like, a passive, like, observer of your thoughts as they come and go. And unfortunately, our thoughts shape our reality. And so you have to make sure that that every thought that enters your head, or that every rumination that happens in your brain, that it's not reality, really. It's just something. One of the questions that I think is good that I learned from that book on Hindu teachings to kind of like prevent this downward spiral into believing everything that's in our head is just whenever you have a thought that comes up in your brain that's very, let's say perhaps disconnected from reality, you can ask yourself, to whom does this thought arise? And then, of course, the answer is going to be to me. And then the follow-up question to that is, well, who am I? And you're going to realize that there is no true self. The self doesn't exist in the sense of like, oh, my individual self, who I am. That isn't really real. That's an illusion. But there is a greater self. There's a higher self that is, this shared higher consciousness that exists within every living thing, and that essence is really who I am. And so then you're able to kind of like let that thought go, and its power to shape your reality kind of like lessens a little bit. But of course, it's like a very, you have to be very diligent in this process of like monitoring your thoughts in your mind space and making sure that you don't just give your thoughts free rein to totally shape and distort reality. Well, thank you for watching so much, and I hope you're having a wonderful holiday season, and I hope you're taking it easy, and thank you so much for watching.